Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan, head of Bluestack Productions, which is a publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And I'm very happy today to be here in Howth with David Healy. David, you're welcome to the interview.
Thank you very much.
David, you've had a long career in a short lifetime, working with various environmental organizations, including Friends of the Irish Environment, the Green Party, FOSTA, and you were the advisor to John Gormley when he was Minister for the Environment in the coalition government.
Yeah.
And what years was that?
2007 until January 2011.
2011. And you're currently working for
That's right.
And could you tell the audience what Oxfam is and what it does?
So Oxfam Ireland is one of a confederation of Oxfams around the world, working on development issues, working on development and humanitarian aid issues. So what I do particularly is policy and advocacy work, mostly focusing on climate change and on biofuels policies, on the impact of biofuels policies in developing countries.
Has Oxfam been involved with addressing climate change as a specific issue within the developmental aid sector?
Within the Confederation, I would say it would be fair to say that during the 90s, certainly increasingly then, with the start of this century, the importance of the issue became stronger and stronger. The increasing evidence came forward that what climate change is threatening to do, and in fact has now started doing, is reversing some of the gains of development and poverty reduction in various countries. And the kind of analysis, the risk there is that a lot of what has been achieved could in many places be turned back. Things could start getting worse where they have been improving.
Now, could you give us an example of that, where climate change has had an adverse effect on past?
One of the particular issues is food production. So what's happened, there's one kind of project in Zimbabwe which is a useful instance of the importance of adaptation to climate change, but also of the limits to adaptation. So in the Ruti district, there's been an irrigation scheme put in. As a result, and the irrigation scheme was always a good idea, even in the absence of climate change. But it was started in the 70s and then abandoned as a result of increasing irregularity in the rains. Oxfam has finished off the reservoir and the pipeline to supply wheat fields in the area. And then the pieces of land have been allocated out to various wheat farmers. At a certain level of variability, the reservoir is too small, will be too small, it'll still empty out if the drought is long enough. Or flooding, and this is what actually happened last year, was floods knocked boulders against the pipeline, so all of a sudden the pipeline was broken. So flooding can have such devastating impact that the agricultural system also ceases to function. So there is a limit. This adaptation is functional, but there is a limit to what the adaptation can do. So these kinds of changes in the rainfall patterns and changes are often things which farmers could adapt to if they knew what they were going to happen and if a new stable pattern was established. But of course, people have developed their systems for one circumstance, and an unknown new circumstance means you don't know what system to use and what approach to take.
It's interesting. It occurred to me, when you're looking into funding and developing a new project or a new program or work, do you now look at it for the climate change impacts that might be happening in 25 years?
Yes. That is absolutely part of the approach. Things have to be. We're saying to other people that things have to be climate change proofed. So obviously it's something we have to do ourselves. To say, well, the project has to be looked at in the context of a changing climate, and it's something that affects, for example, buildings have to be designed with a consciousness of what is the flooding risk now, which is what you would expect good practice to take account, but what is the future flooding risk?
It's interesting that, and I never thought I would ever say this, but I'm so thankful for the insurance companies who get climate change in ways that many do not, and they are now, Lloyd's of London has now got a policy they're requiring any reinsurance companies to anticipate climate change
Yeah.
for the risk analysis, which is terrific.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that within the kind of the range of businesses, that we have a bit of a tendency to see business as one sector, which of course it isn't. It's a range of businesses, but many of them are very short term, but some of them aren't.
Yeah.
Some of them are explicitly based that they only make money if they get their long-term decision making right.
Yeah.
And insurance is like that. They have to be long-term analysis.
Now tell us then, what are you doing for Oxfam in terms of you just mentioned in passing the European Union stuff?
Yeah, so Oxfam is engaged, I suppose, in advocacy and policy work around the EU's 2030 targets.
Uh-huh.
The EU's position going into the negotiations at the UNFCCC for a climate deal to be reached in Paris in 2015.
Uh-huh.
And then at the Irish level, well, and that's in cooperation then with the other Oxfams outside the EU, which are working in their countries. And there's a good network both in developed and developing countries of Oxfam people. So kind of trying to engage with all the different partners in the process. And through the NGO network, particularly CAN, the Climate Action Network.
Uh-huh.
And then within Ireland, the biggest engagement has been in relation to the climate change bill,
Uh-huh.
which has been, it's 10 years at this stage, looking for a climate change, at least 10, more than that.
And wasn't it worth waiting for?
Yeah. Well, it's not yet, let's say.
All right. Yeah.
It's not quite, the recipe isn't quite figured out yet.
No.
What we have at the moment as a proposal, has some significant flaws, and even some things which we had thought would have been acceptable compromises when they were suggested by the Oireachtas committee, which
Yeah.
considered the draft, that are not there. So
Uh-huh. What's the gaping holes in that bill for you?
fundamentally, we'd like to see a bill which includes targets
Right.
and which gives a very clear trajectory. Now, the core of the bill, I suppose, comes from a recognition that the governance system that operates here has not been dealing with climate change as a challenge, and it's back to the long-term versus short-term issues, and that climate change is a long-term problem. So we need transport, agriculture, energy, environment departments thinking on a 2050 timeframe, and secondly, we need them all taking responsibility. And as it stands, we have an electoral cycle of 5 years, so the governments will not last more than 5 years. They might be re-elected into another government, but you have a departmental system where up to now responsibility for climate change has pretty much been landed on the Department of the Environment, which holds very few of the levers. So if you go back to the first climate change strategy, which was adopted as a government strategy, it said we should have a carbon tax, and we should switch money point from coal. And the government didn't implement that strategy. There was no carbon tax. The Department of Finance, the Minister for Finance, decided they didn't want a carbon tax, and the ESB or the Department of Energy decided, well, no, we're not going to switch money point. We know how the system fails to work. Another instance is within the agriculture sector. Livestock emissions are a big part of Ireland's total greenhouse gas emissions, and the agriculture sector emissions were being projected out year on year, and all of a sudden there was a spike of 1 million, and in the context of total emissions in the range of 60 to 70 million over recent years, it's a lot. And really effectively the first policymakers and responsible for climate change in the Department of the Environment knew about it was, the EPA started coming back to say, well, there's going to be this 1 million more emissions from the agriculture sector, and the reason is they've introduced a policy, it's called Suckler Cow Scheme. It was effectively a stimulus, which was increasing the number of cattle. This was done. It went through no climate analysis before it was decided, and the people trying to comply with Ireland's international legal obligations and the EU law obligations kind of find out afterwards. So there was a lack of acceptance. The Department of Transport, very similar, completely failing to integrate climate into its policy making. and they established a sustainable travel unit. But in fact, what that unit seems to be, as far as we can understand it, is that as opposed to trying to deal with the sustainability of the entire transport system, it just deals with the more sustainable modes of travel. And the rest of the system,
Goes its merry way.
building motorways and dealing with public transport without seeing its value as a climate change mitigation strategy, is continuing on as it has. So the idea behind the climate change bill, to get back to that basic point, is that every department needs to have a legal obligation. Every minister needs to have a legal obligation. And indeed, all the other bodies in the state, the local authorities need to have legal obligations, so that everybody's working towards an agreed national objective.
With regard to the issue of the advisory body, are you comfortable that it's going to be an independent body, somewhat like the UK committee, which seems to have a good bit of independence and oversight over what the government's doing?
Yeah, no, I mean the UK body is the model we'd like to follow, and the other model we'd like to follow is the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, which was established in 2011 in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and they're both small committees and made up of entirely independent people, and then the function of the UK committee, is specifically to give advice in the public interest, and the reason that this is important is that it as it stands, with the kind of competition between various departments, it turns into a test of strength between departments, and a negotiating process there, and the quality of policy making from an overall point of view can suffer, because it can be agriculture refusing to take on responsibilities, transport refusing to take on responsibilities, energy deciding which responsibilities it wants and which ones it doesn't. So an independent advisory body saying, well, look, this is the best measure from an overall point of view, and these are the things that need to go with it and how you should handle it, is a good model. The Fiscal Advisory Council here then has, a statutorily independent function in advising the government in a way which hasn't been taken over into the climate change bill. And having passed the Fiscal Advisory Council 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, last year the Oireachtas Environment Committee looked at it and said, well, look, this is the model. You have 5 people, they're all independent. Their independence is underlined in the legislation. It says they shall be independent in the exercise of their functions, and then they have, they shall advise the government on this, and the government shall publish their report, and the government shall give its response. And it's a process of accountability within the system, and to the public. What's being proposed is a committee with a chair, but with 4 people automatically included from government agencies. And to be honest, as far as these people are concerned, I mean, first of all, you want a climate change committee where people can devote their time to it. The head of the SRI, the head of Teagasc, the head of the EPA, and the head of the SEAI have plenty of other things to be doing. You want one where they're independent. Now, the head of Teagasc and the head of ESRI are accountable back to their own boards, obviously, and it's right that they should be. But it really doesn't make sense that our climate change policy, that a committee which needs to work by consensus, to be effective, it needs to be bringing itself along, developing a good collective view. It's not going to get anywhere if it has to try and fight things out corner against corner. We don't want the committee to replicate the fight between agriculture, transport, energy and environment, which goes on at a cabinet table or at interdepartmental committees, again, in the climate change committee. So it really doesn't make sense it does make sense that people with transport, energy and agricultural expertise are on the committee, but not that they have any duties back to stakeholders. And that's a real problem with the way it's been set up.
Now, let's go back to the agriculture, because that is a pressing issue. And you mentioned the pre-harvest 2020 spike. And what, from somebody working in developmental aid and world hunger, what's your view of harvest 2020?
I suppose the important point to start with is that, our primary concern, our biggest concern in Oxfam about climate change is the impact on food security. That's an impact that we have seen already and that is projected. And if you look at the Working Group 2 report, what it says about food security is really quite terrifying. Even to this state of saying that in the longer term, the existence of large-scale human civilizations is threatened by climate change through the food insecurity risk, which has to be taken as a terrifying, thing for a scientific committee to be telling us. What it's saying, even in the shorter term, in the next couple of decades, is that climate change is likely to increase the number of people suffering from malnutrition and hunger. So this, is reason number one for engaging with climate change as far as Oxfam is concerned. Within Ireland, there is an agricultural industry. There's a significant business opportunity which has been identified, and that opportunity particularly has to do with the shift in global diet from meat towards meat and milk, increased consumption of meat and dairy products. As it stands, 90% of Ireland's beef production is exported. And the Food Harvest 2020 is an industry-led strategy document which has been more or less adopted as a government policy, and it's an interesting question from a number of respects, but which is about an increase in the value of agricultural production. And certainly part of that is an increase in the total quantity of meat and dairy products. So this document was produced by an industry-led group, has never actually been adopted by the government as policy. In order to do that, it has to go to Cabinet. It's very straightforward. You know what's government policy because the Cabinet agrees to it, and it hasn't been to Cabinet. But it was published by the department. It's been repeatedly relied on by state agencies as if it was a policy document. So, for example, there's a Board Planalda decision, where it refers to it, the Food Harvest 2020 strategy published by the Department of Agriculture 2010. There are repeated references by ministers towards implementing it, and the chair of the implementation committee is the Minister for Agriculture. It's presented all over the place as if it was a government policy document. So the Irish Environment made a submission to the European Commission saying there's something wrong here. The government has produced this document and there's been no SEA. And it seems pretty obvious to us that there's going to be enormous environmental impacts of a massive increase in livestock in the country. And so the two commissioners themselves, Potocnik for the environment and Chialosh for agriculture, wrote back to FIE and said yes, there's a big issue here, and we were asking the Irish authorities to address it, and we're also looking into it in terms of the technical legality of whether it legally needs an SEA. We've asked them to address it in the substance anyway, because as a policy basis it's not good. So a report has been done, an SEA report has been, an environmental report.
That was just recently, this year?
It's been done this year, and it acknowledges some of the things, there's some flaws in it, but the key point about it is that it's not led to any change in the document. And the whole essence of an SEA is that you do the analysis, you have a public consultation, and then you take the results of the analysis and the consultation, the discussion, and that informs your final policy document. Well, that has
no effect at all.
And the answer from the Department of Agriculture is, we're changing the policy all the time.
But it's not our policy.
Yeah, but it's not our policy. But we're implementing it.
But do you think that the Harvest 2020 has any impact on the world hunger?
Yes, people who are hungry are not hungry from a lack of butter or milk powder. They don't go to the supermarkets. They're small farmers. They're hungry if the rains are bad and the crops fail, and they don't have enough grain in store to last them through till the next harvest. The dynamics of malnutrition, hunger, food insecurity have nothing to do with the export of luxury foodstuffs from Ireland. What is happening in Ireland is that we're increasing our imports of animal feedstuffs, which are grains and pulses, which are actually, the affordable things which people might have a chance. So our cattle are competing on a global market
with poor consumers.
The question of grain being going and land being used to feed livestock
Uh-huh.
is in some way similar to the whole biofuels thing
Right,
that we're working
right.
on, where policy incentives have been introduced in developed countries,
Uh-huh.
aimed at increasing reducing the greenhouse gas impact of our transport systems.
Uh-huh.
And because of the kind of inherently large amounts of energy used by cars and trucks as ways of getting things around and people around, there isn't an easy renewable alternative. Electric cars are, as rare as hen's teeth, and the easy alternative was seen to be biofuels.
Right.
And that was assumed without doing the calculations of where is all the biofuel going to come from.
Mhm.
There's a limited amount of fixed amount of land on the planet, fixed amount of sunshine hits the planet every day. So, the energy calculations can be done as to how much energy comes from the sun into plants
Mhm.
and could then be available to be converted into a liquid fuel through a process losing energy all the way along
Mhm.
until you get this extraordinarily valuable stuff, a liquid fuel with a very high energy density.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what you need in order to take your heavy vehicles for long distances. And so, it's wonderful stuff, liquid fuels,
Uh-huh.
but we cannot replace the enormous, heritage of petrol and diesel or from the oil reserves
Uh-huh.
laid down over millions of years
Uh-huh.
with annual production of ethanol or biodiesel.
Mhm.
Physically, it's not possible.
Uh-huh.
And what happens, of course, anytime there's a resource squeeze, which is what's happening, there's a resource squeeze for land,
Mhm.
is that the poor are the ones who lose access to the resource. So we've had food price spikes as a result of the conversion of land
Yeah.
to biofuel use, either directly taking the food crop ethanol for ethanol or biodiesel, or simply changing the crops in order to do it.
Uh-huh.
And with a lot of people saying this is linked to a lot of political instability in recent years, but certainly with measurable impacts on hunger and malnutrition in many countries around the world.
Now, one other issue I wanted to kind of cover was the messaging for fundraising for developmental aid. Now, I think it's gotten very complicated because of the climate change layer.
Mhm.
In the old days, it was fairly simplistic. You go to somebody who has some disposable assets and income and say, "We need your help to help these poor people, these vulnerable populations,
Yeah.
communities across the world." And now we're saying that we really need your help for these people because they're really, really in trouble because of the climate change impacts on that.
Yeah.
And then some people like me or other people are standing behind you saying, "And it's your fault."
Yeah.
You who were asking them for the money from the developed world, you made your money off this cheap fossil fuels and your lifestyle, and it's your fault. Now, some people are saying that very softly, and some people are saying it very aggressively, and it complicates the message, I think, doesn't it?
Yes, it can. I mean, I suppose we've always in Oxfam pointed to the causes of the problem,
Uh-huh.
as well as addressing them. So certainly the global trade relationships, have always been a big issue. For example, we pointed to, and at the moment we're pushing a lot of attention on the issues of the financial system,
Okay.
and the tax system, particularly the role that companies are able to use tax evasion or tax avoidance schemes and tax havens in a way which is starving developing countries, governments
Uh-huh.
of tax revenues.
Okay.
And so that when the Zambian government, for example, is failing to get revenues from a sugar company because they're being funneled through some kind of a scheme in the IFSC in Dublin,
Uh-huh.
that this has very real consequences for health, education, welfare services in Zambia.
Uh-huh.
So obviously that in a sense is saying to the Irish government, your law is at fault here. We've had a good record in certainly the Irish public in supporting Oxfam and other development agencies in recognising that the obligation, the human obligation of assisting development, and I think a lot of people would recognise the climate justice obligation
That's
as well.
right.
Yeah.
David, thanks for talking with us today.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.